Hey guys, tonight we begin with the most powerful weapon humanity has ever created. A device so devastating that its very existence rewrote the rules of war, peace and survival itself. We're diving into the hydrogen bomb, not as a weapon of battle, but as a mathematical abstraction made terrifyingly real. A tool of deterrence, a subject of endless testing, and the cornerstone of strategic doctrines that shaped the Cold War and continue to haunt us today. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima in August 1945 released energy equivalent to roughly 15,000 tons of TNT. It flattened a city, killed tens of thousands instantly, and introduced the world to nuclear warfare. To most observers, this seemed like the absolute limit of destructive power. Surely, they thought, humanity had reached the ceiling of annihilation. But they were wrong. Catastrophically, tragically wrong. Within months of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, physicists already understood that the atomic bomb was merely a stepping stone. The fission reaction that powered those weapons, splitting heavy atoms like uranium or plutonium, was impressive. But there was another process, one that occurred naturally in the heart of stars: fusion. The combining of a light atomic nuclei, typically isotopes of hydrogen, to create heavier elements and release staggering amounts of energy. Far more energy than fission could ever produce. The theoretical foundation for a fusion weapon existed before the war even ended. Physicists like Edward Teller had been discussing it since the early days of the Manhattan Project. But theory and reality are two very different things. Building a hydrogen bomb required solving problems that seemed almost impossible. How do you create temperatures hot enough to initiate fusion? How do you contain the reaction long enough for it to release useful energy? How do you design a weapon that doesn't just fizzle out or destroy itself before it detonates? The answer, as it turned out, was both elegant and horrifying. You use an atomic bomb as a trigger. The fission weapon creates temperatures of millions of degrees, hot enough to compress and ignite a fusion fuel, typically deuterium and tritium, isotopes of hydrogen. The fusion reaction then releases neutrons that can trigger additional fission in a surrounding shell of uranium. This creates a three-stage cascade: fission, fusion, fission, a thermonuclear explosion. When scientists finally cracked the design in the early 1950s, they didn't just build a bigger bomb, they built a weapon whose yield could theoretically scale without limit. While atomic bombs were measured in kilotons, thousands of tons of TNT equivalent, hydrogen bombs were measured in megatons, millions of tons. The first true thermonuclear test, Ivy Mike in 1952, released 10.4 megatons. That's more than 700 times the power of the Hiroshima bomb, and that was just the beginning. But here's where the story takes a strange turn. Despite creating the most powerful weapon in human history, no hydrogen bomb has ever been used in war. Not one. Not in Korea, not in Vietnam, not in the Middle East, not anywhere. The hydrogen bomb was never designed to be used. It was designed to prevent use, to deter, to threaten, to paralyze decision-making through sheer existential terror. The hydrogen bomb became the ultimate abstraction, a weapon whose power was most effective when it remained theoretical, lurking in silos and submarines, never fired but always present. This is the story of deterrence theory, the logic that said the best way to prevent war was to make war unthinkable. It's the story of testing, the decades-long process of perfecting weapons that would never see combat. And it's the story of strategic doctrine, the Cold War chess game where moves were calculated in megatons and survival was measured in minutes. Welcome to the age of the hydrogen bomb, where the greatest weapon ever made became the weapon no one could ever use. The journey toward the hydrogen bomb didn't begin in a laboratory. It began in the minds of physicists who understood that the universe itself ran on fusion. Every star in the sky, including our own sun, generates energy by fusing hydrogen atoms into helium under immense pressure and temperature. This process, occurring naturally across billions of light years, releases the energy that makes life possible. And somewhere in the 1930s and 1940s, scientists realized that if nature could do it, perhaps humanity could replicate it. The earliest serious discussions about fusion weapons occurred within the Manhattan Project itself. While the primary focus was on building a fission bomb, a small group of physicists led by Edward Teller began exploring whether a secondary fusion reaction could amplify the destructive power of an atomic bomb. Teller was obsessed with the idea. He called it the super. Even as his colleagues focused on making Little Boy and Fat Man work, Teller kept returning to fusion, sketching designs, running calculations, and insisting that this was the future. Edward Teller was a complicated figure, brilliant, driven, and often difficult to work with. Born in Hungary in 1908, he fled Europe ahead of the Nazi rise and joined the American nuclear program with fierce determination. While Robert Oppenheimer coordinated the Manhattan Project with diplomatic skill, Teller pushed boundaries, questioned assumptions, and fixated on possibilities that others considered premature or impossible. His colleagues both admired and were frustrated by him. Some saw him as a visionary, others saw him as dangerously obsessed. But Teller's early designs didn't work. The problem was ignition. Fusion requires temperatures found in the cores of stars, tens of millions of degrees. A fission bomb could theoretically produce those temperatures, but only for a fraction of a second, and only in a very small space. How do you compress fusion fuel, heat it to stellar temperatures, and sustain the reaction long enough to release massive amounts of energy? Teller's initial approach, simply surrounding a fission bomb with liquid deuterium, wasn't efficient. The heat would disperse too quickly. The reaction would fizzle. For years, the super remained theoretical, a dream weapon that existed only on chalkboards and in the fevered imagination of Edward Teller. Calculations show that even under ideal conditions, the fusion reaction might not sustain itself. The deuterium might absorb more energy than it released. The entire concept might be impossible. Some physicists openly doubted whether a fusion bomb could ever work at all. But then in 1949, something changed. The Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, years earlier than American intelligence had predicted. The test, codenamed First Lightning by the Soviets and Joe 1 by the Americans, shattered the nuclear monopoly that had given the United States unquestioned strategic dominance. Suddenly, America's atomic arsenal seemed less impressive. If the Soviets could build fission bombs, they could build an entire nuclear arsenal. The balance of power had shifted overnight. Panic set in. Politicians demanded answers. Military leaders wanted options. Intelligence agencies scrambled to understand how the Soviets had succeeded so quickly. Some suspected espionage, and they were right. Klaus Fuchs, a physicist who had worked on the Manhattan Project, had been passing secrets to Soviet handlers for years. But regardless of how the Soviets achieved their breakthrough, the result was the same. The United States, no longer held a nuclear monopoly, and the question became urgent. Could America build a weapon so powerful that it would restore its strategic advantage? President Harry Truman, facing immense pressure from military leaders, congressional hawks, and his own advisors, authorized a crash program to develop the hydrogen bomb in January 1950. The decision was controversial. Many Manhattan Project scientists, including J. Robert Oppenheimer, opposed it vehemently. They argued that the hydrogen bomb was unnecessary, immoral, and destabilizing. Oppenheimer believed that building it would spark an arms race that could end in apocalypse. He was right, of course, but he was also overruled. Oppenheimer's opposition to the hydrogen bomb was both moral and strategic. He chaired the General Advisory Committee of the Atomic Energy Commission, and in October 1949, the committee issued a report recommending against development of the super. The report argued that the hydrogen bomb was not a weapon, which can be used exclusively for the destruction of material installations of military or semi-military purposes. Its use therefore carries much further than the atomic bomb itself, the policy of exterminating civilian populations. It was a weapon of genocide, not war. But Oppenheimer's opposition made him enemies. Edward Teller never forgave him. Military leaders saw him as weak, even traitorous. Politicians questioned his loyalty. The seeds were planted for Oppenheimer's eventual downfall, when in 1954 his security clearance was revoked in a hearing that destroyed his reputation and career. The man who had led the creation of the atomic bomb was cast aside. a casualty of the very forces he had helped unleash. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In 1951, a mathematician named Stanislaw Ulam proposed a radical new design concept. Ulam, a Polish-born mathematician who had worked at Los Alamos during the war, approached the fusion problem from a different angle. Instead of trying to ignite fusion fuel directly, what if you used the radiation from a fission bomb to compress the fusion fuel before it had time to blow apart? This idea, refined by Teller and others, became known as the Teller-Ulam design. It involved two stages, a primary fission bomb and a secondary fusion stage, separated but linked by a clever arrangement of materials that channeled the energy in just the right way. The genius of the Teller-Ulam design lay in its use of radiation implosion. When a fission bomb detonates, it releases enormous amounts of X-ray radiation before the physical debris can expand. These X-rays travel at the speed of light, meaning they reach the fusion fuel before the shockwave does. By carefully designing a casing around the bomb, these X-rays could be reflected and focused, using radiation pressure to compress the fusion fuel to incredible densities. This compression, occurring faster than the fuel could heat up and expand, created the conditions necessary for fusion, and once fusion began, it released neutrons that could trigger additional fission in a surrounding uranium shell, amplifying the explosion even further. It was elegant, it was terrifying, and it worked. The Teller-Ulam design solved the ignition problem that had plagued earlier attempts. The radiation implosion provided the compression needed to achieve fusion, while the fission primary provided the heat. The design was so efficient that it could theoretically scale to unlimited yields. You could make the fusion secondary larger, add more stages, wrap it in more uranium. Each modification increased the yield. There was no theoretical upper limit, only practical constraints of size and deliverability. On November 1st, 1952, the United States detonated Ivy Mike on Eniwetok Atoll in the Pacific. The device wasn't a deliverable weapon. It was a massive experimental apparatus, weighing over 82 tons, requiring a building-sized structure to house it, and cooled by cryogenic equipment to keep the liquid deuterium fuel stable. It looked less like a bomb and more like a small factory. Technicians spent weeks preparing the site, running cables, installing diagnostic equipment, and evacuating personnel to safe distances. When Ivy Mike detonated, it erased an entire island. Illusiolab, a small coral island in the atoll, simply ceased to exist, replaced by a crater 6,040 feet in diameter and 164 feet deep. The fireball stretched over 3 miles wide, incinerating everything within its radius. The mushroom cloud rose over 130,000 feet into the stratosphere, punching through the tropopause and spreading radioactive debris across thousands of square miles. Scientists watching from ships 20 miles away reported feeling the heat on their faces, like standing too close to a roaring bonfire. The shock wave travelling across the water rocked the observation vessels despite their distance. The explosion released 10.4 megatons of energy, vaporizing coral, ships, and measurement equipment. Instruments placed miles away melted. Camera footage captured the moment the fireball emerged, a sphere of plasma brighter than the sun, expanding with horrifying speed. For a few seconds, 2 suns existed in the Pacific sky. Then the fireball rose, cooling and darkening, forming the characteristic mushroom cloud that would become the symbol of thermonuclear power. The data collected from Ivy Mike was staggering. The explosion was roughly 700 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. The yield exceeded even optimistic predictions. The fusion reaction had worked exactly as the Teller-Ulam design predicted. The hydrogen bomb was no longer theoretical. It was real, and the world would never be the same. But Ivy Mike had limitations. It was enormous, immobile, and required liquid deuterium fuel that had to be kept at cryogenic temperatures. You couldn't load Ivy Mike onto a bomber. You couldn't mount it on a missile. It was a proof of concept, not a weapon. Military planners needed something deliverable, something that could be loaded onto a B-52 and dropped on a target thousands of miles away. That meant developing solid fuel, compact designs, and reliable triggering mechanisms. It meant more tests, more refinements, more iterations. The solution was lithium deuteride, a solid compound that could serve as fusion fuel without requiring cryogenic cooling. When bombarded with neutrons from the fission primary, lithium-6 would split into tritium and helium, and the tritium would then fuse with deuterium. This eliminated the need for liquid hydrogen, making the weapon deliverable. The first test of a lithium deuterate device was Castle Bravo, and it would become the most infamous nuclear test in American history. The Soviet Union, racing to keep pace, detonated its first true thermonuclear weapon in August 1953, just 9 months after Ivy Mike. The Soviet device, designed by Andrei Sakharov and known as RDS-6 or Sloika layer cake, used a different design. It alternated layers of fission and fusion materials, creating a boosted weapon rather than a true two-stage thermonuclear device. The yield was only 400 kilotons, far less than Ivy Mike, but it proved that the Soviets understood fusion principles. More importantly, the Soviet device was deliverable, small enough to be dropped from a bomber, giving the USSR a functional hydrogen bomb before the United States had one. But the Soviets knew their design was inferior. It couldn't scale to the multi-megaton yields that true two-stage devices could achieve. Soviet scientists, including Sakharov, worked frantically to develop their own version of the Teller-Ulam design. They succeeded in November 1955, detonating RDS-37, a 1.6 megaton true two-stage thermonuclear weapon. The arms race was now fully engaged. Both superpowers had cracked the secret of fusion, and both were building arsenals that could destroy civilization. Britain followed with its first hydrogen bomb test in 1957. The test, codenamed Grapple X, yielded 1.8 megatons, and confirmed that Britain too could join the thermonuclear club. France tested its first hydrogen bomb in 1968, after years of development and political pressure. China, which had conducted its first fission test in 1964, successfully tested a hydrogen bomb in 1967, a remarkably short timeline that surprised Western intelligence agencies. Each nation that acquired the hydrogen bomb did so not to use it, but to join an exclusive, horrifying club, a club whose membership guaranteed survival through the promise of mutual annihilation. Because that's what the hydrogen bomb represented. Not a tool of war, but a tool of existential threat. It was too powerful to use, too devastating to ignore, and too essential, in the twisted logic of the Cold War, to abandon. The genie was out of the bottle, and no amount of wishing could put it back. The hydrogen bomb didn't just change weapons technology, it changed the entire philosophy of war. For thousands of years, warfare followed a relatively simple logic. Build a stronger army, develop better weapons, defeat your enemy on the battlefield, and claim victory. Wars were fought to be won. Generals planned campaigns. Soldiers advanced. Territories changed hands. Victory, however costly, was at least theoretically possible. But the hydrogen bomb shattered that logic completely. How do you win a war when both sides possess weapons capable of destroying entire nations in minutes? How do you plan a military campaign when the opening move could be the simultaneous incineration of every major city on the planet? How do you define victory when survival itself becomes uncertain? These weren't just tactical questions, they were existential ones, and the answers that emerged formed the basis of deterrence theory, the strangest, most paradoxical military doctrine ever conceived. Deterrence theory rests on a simple, chilling premise. The best way to prevent nuclear war is to make nuclear, or so horrifying that no rational leader would ever start one. You don't build hydrogen bombs to use them, you build them to ensure they're never used. The weapon's power lies not in its explosion, but in its threat. Its mere existence is supposed to freeze conflict, paralyze aggression, and force adversaries into an uneasy perpetual standoff. This idea wasn't entirely new. Throughout history, nations had tried to deter enemies by appearing strong. Build impressive fortifications, maintain large armies, demonstrate your capacity for violence, and hope potential adversaries think twice before attacking. But the hydrogen bomb took deterrence to an entirely different level. Previous deterrence relied on the possibility of defeat. The hydrogen bomb relied on the certainty of annihilation. It wasn't about losing a war. It was about ceasing to exist as a civilization. The intellectual architects of deterrence theory included strategists like Bernard Brodie, Herman Kahn, Thomas Schelling, and Albert Wohlstetter. These were not generals or soldiers. They were economists, mathematicians, and political scientists who approached nuclear strategy the way one might approach a chess problem or an economic model. Their writings, dense with game theory and probabilistic reasoning, treated nuclear war as an abstract puzzle to be solved through logic. They wrote papers with titles like On the Implications of Total Destruction and The Delicate Balance of Terror. Their work was brilliant, unsettling, and utterly divorced from the human reality of what they were discussing. Bernard Brodie, writing in 1946, made the foundational observation that would define the nuclear age. Thus far, the chief purpose of our military establishment has been to win wars. From now on, its chief purpose must be to avert them. This was revolutionary. For the first time in history, the primary goal of a military wasn't victory, it was prevention. The entire apparatus of nuclear strategy, the bombers, the missiles, the submarines, the command centres, existed not to fight, but to deter. Military power became a theatrical performance, a display meant to convince audiences that the show must never actually begin. But deterrence only works if your adversary believes you're willing to use your weapons. This created a bizarre psychological problem. You had to appear irrational enough to follow through on your threats, but rational enough that your adversary believed you wouldn't launch unless provoked. You had to convince the Soviets that if they attacked, you would retaliate with total nuclear war, even though such retaliation would guarantee your own destruction. It was a bluff, but a bluff you could never admit was a bluff. Credibility became everything. Thomas Schelling, one of the most influential nuclear strategists, explored this psychological dimension extensively. His book, The Strategy of Conflict, analysed how threats work, how commitments are made credible, and how nations can signal resolve without actually going to war. Schelling introduced concepts like the threat that leaves something to chance and brinkmanship. You didn't need to convince your enemy that you would definitely retaliate. You just needed to convince them that there was a significant probability you might. Enough uncertainty to make the gamble unacceptable. Enough fear to paralyse decision-making. Deterrence wasn't about certainty. It was about calculated ambiguity. Schelling also explored the concept of commitment mechanisms, ways to make threats credible by limiting your own options. If you could convince your adversary that you had no choice but to retaliate, that you'd tied your own hands through automated systems or political constraints, then your threat became more believable. This led to some genuinely disturbing proposals, including the idea of a doomsday machine, an automated system that would launch nuclear weapons automatically if certain conditions were met, with no possibility of human override. The logic was that such a system would be perfectly credible. The Soviets would know that even if they destroyed American leadership, the doomsday machine would still retaliate. Of course, such a system would also be insane, eliminating any possibility of restraint, second thoughts, or error correction. Thankfully, no doomsday machine was ever built, though elements of automated launch systems came uncomfortably close. Herman Kahn, another prominent strategist, took a different approach. His book on thermonuclear war was a massive, exhaustive analysis of nuclear scenarios, running through hundreds of possible outcomes, casualty estimates, and recovery timelines. Kahn argued that nuclear war, while catastrophic, was not unthinkable. He believed that nations could survive and recover from nuclear exchange, that civil defense could save millions of lives, and that deterrence required not just threatening retaliation, but demonstrating the will to endure and rebuild. His work was controversial. Critics accused him of treating nuclear war too casually, of turning mass death into bloodless statistics. But Kahn believed that avoiding nuclear war required thinking seriously about what nuclear war would actually entail, rather than dismissing it as simply the end of civilization. Kahn's work introduced dark concepts like acceptable losses. How many casualties could a nation sustain and still function? 10 million? 50 million? At what point does a nation cease to exist as a coherent entity? These questions, grim as they were, became central to strategic planning. If deterrence failed, leaders needed to know what they were facing, what decisions would minimise damage, and whether there were any scenarios that didn't end in total annihilation. This logic gave rise to the concept of mutual assured destruction, or MAD, a term so darkly appropriate it sounds like satire. MAD formalised the idea that if both superpowers maintained enough nuclear weapons to survive a first strike and still retaliate with devastating force, neither side would dare attack. The result would be mutual suicide. And because suicide is irrational, the thinking went, neither side would ever pull the trigger. MAD required specific capabilities. First, you needed a large, diverse arsenal. Bombers, land-based missiles, submarine-launched missiles. This ensured that even if your enemy destroyed part of your arsenal in a surprise attack, enough would survive to strike back. This concept was called second strike capability, and it became the foundation of deterrence. If you couldn't retaliate after being attacked, deterrence collapsed. The enemy might be tempted to launch a preemptive strike, gambling that they could destroy your forces before you could respond. Second, you needed credible delivery systems. Your weapons had to be able to reach enemy cities reliably, penetrate air defences and detonate with high probability. A missile that couldn't reach its target, or a bomber that got shot down, didn't deter anyone. Reliability became paramount. Both superpowers invested enormous resources in testing and refining their delivery systems, conducting hundreds of test launches to ensure their missiles would work when needed. Third, you needed secure command and control. Your leaders had to be able to authorize retaliation even after a nuclear attack had begun. This meant hardened command bunkers, airborne command posts, secure communications networks, and succession plans ensuring that someone with launch authority would always survive. Both superpowers built elaborate systems to ensure continuity of command, including flying command posts that circled continuously, ready to coordinate retaliation if ground-based command centers were destroyed. Both the United States and the Soviet Union invested staggering resources into building these capabilities. At the height of the Cold War, the US maintained over 30,000 nuclear warheads. The Soviets had a similar number. Most were hydrogen bombs, each far more powerful than the weapons dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Together, these arsenals held enough destructive power to end human civilization multiple times over. The phrase overkill became literal. You didn't just have enough weapons to destroy your enemy, you had enough to destroy them 10 times, 20 times, 100 times. And yet, both sides kept building more. Why? Because deterrence required not just capability, but perception. You needed your enemy to believe that your arsenal was invulnerable, that your resolve was unshakable, and that retaliation was guaranteed. Any doubt, any perceived weakness, could undermine deterrence. So both sides engaged in an arms race driven not by military necessity, but by psychological requirements. More warheads, more delivery systems, more redundancy. Overkill became official policy, endorsed, funded and expanded by successive administrations and general secretaries. But here's the paradox at the heart of deterrence theory. If deterrence works, you never use your weapons. And if you never use them, how do you prove they work? You can't. You're stuck in an endless loop of preparation for a war that must never happen, building weapons designed never to be fired, and hoping that the very act of building them prevents the need to use them. It's circular logic, sustained only by the constant gnawing fear that if you stop, if you relax, if you let your guard down for even a moment, your adversary might strike. Critics pointed out the insanity of this logic. Philosopher Bertrand Russell called it a balance of terror. Psychologists warned that living under constant threat of annihilation would create societal trauma. Religious leaders condemned the moral bankruptcy of threatening to kill millions of innocent civilians. And yet, deterrence persisted. Because as mad as it seemed, the alternative, actually fighting a nuclear war, seemed even worse. What if deterrence failed? What if a miscalculation, a technical error, or a rogue leader triggered a war? Once the missiles launched, MAD offered no way out. Retaliation was automatic, irreversible, final. There was no defense, no negotiation, no surrender, just annihilation. The entire system rested on the assumption that leaders would always act rationally, that accidents would never happen, and that technology would never fail. It was a fragile foundation for the survival of civilization. And yet, for decades, deterrence worked. The United States and the Soviet Union never fought a direct nuclear war. They fought proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and dozens of other countries. They engaged in espionage, propaganda, and political maneuvering, but they never launched the hydrogen bombs. Whether this was because deterrence theory was brilliant or because humanity got incredibly, statistically improbably lucky remains an open question. Historians debate whether we avoided nuclear war because of the wisdom of our leaders, the robustness of our systems, or sheer random chance. Either way, the hydrogen bomb became the cornerstone of Cold War strategy. Not because it could win wars, but because it made wars unthinkable. The weapon was never meant for the battlefield, it was meant for the mind. And in that dark, paradoxical space between threat and use, between capability and restraint, the hydrogen bomb defined the second half of the 20th century. It shaped alliances, dictated military spending, determined what it meant to be a superpower, and hung over every diplomatic crisis like a guillotine blade, visible, terrifying, and waiting. If deterrence theory was the philosophy behind the hydrogen bomb, testing was the messy, dangerous, and often catastrophic process of making that philosophy real. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. You can't just build a hydrogen bomb based on theory and hope it works. You have to test it. You have to detonate actual thermonuclear devices, measure their yields, study their effects, analyse their radiation, and refine your designs. And for nearly 4 decades, that's exactly what the nuclear powers did, exploding hydrogen bombs across deserts, oceans and remote islands in a scientific program that doubled as an apocalyptic rehearsal. The United States conducted its first hydrogen bomb test, Ivy Mike, in 1952. But as we've discussed, Ivy Mike was a proof of concept, not a weapon. It was enormous, immobile, and required a small factory's worth of cryogenic equipment to keep its liquid deuterium fuel cold. Military planners needed something deliverable, something that could be loaded onto a bomber or missile and dropped on a target thousands of miles away. That meant developing solid fuel, compact designs, reliable triggering mechanisms, and predictable yields. It meant more tests. Many, many more tests. Between 1945 and 1992, the United States conducted over 1,000 nuclear tests. Many of these were hydrogen bomb tests or experiments with thermonuclear components, ranging from small tactical devices to massive strategic weapons. Each test had specific goals: validating a new design, measuring radiation effects, testing delivery systems, studying blast dynamics, or simply demonstrating capability to adversaries and allies alike. Testing became a massive scientific and logistical enterprise, employing thousands of engineers, physicists, technicians, and military personnel. The most infamous test series was Operation Castle, conducted in 1954 at Bikini Atoll and Enewetak Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Castle included 6 detonations, each testing different thermonuclear designs. The first, and by far the most notorious, was Castle Bravo on March 1st, 1954. Bravo was supposed to test a lithium deuteride fusion device with an expected yield of 6 megatons. Scientists and military planners chose 6 megatons as a safe, measurable yield that would provide useful data without causing excessive contamination. They were catastrophically wrong. Castle Bravo detonated with a yield of 15 megatons, 2.5 times more powerful than expected. It remains the largest nuclear explosion ever conducted by the United States and one of the most dangerous accidents in nuclear history. The miscalculation stemmed from an incorrect assumption about lithium-7, the more common isotope of lithium. Scientists had assumed lithium-7 was inert, that only lithium-6 would participate in the fusion reaction. But under the intense neutron flux from the fission primary, lithium-7 also contributed to the fusion process, dramatically amplifying the yield. The consequences were immediate and horrifying. The fireball stretched over 4 miles across, far larger than predicted. The mushroom cloud rose 130,000 feet into the stratosphere, punching through atmospheric layers and spreading radioactive debris across an enormous area. But the real disaster was the fallout, radioactive ash and particles, propelled by unpredicted winds, spread across more than 7,000 square miles of the Pacific Ocean. Islands that were supposed to be safe, like Rongelap and Utirik, were blanketed with radioactive snow. The crew of a Japanese fishing vessel, the Lucky Dragon No. 5, were working 90 miles from the blast site, well outside the designated danger zone. They watched the explosion, saw the flash on the horizon, and continued fishing. A few hours later, white ash began falling from the sky, covering the deck and the crew. The fishermen, having no idea what it was, touched it, brushed it off their clothes, and continued working. Within hours, they began feeling sick. Nausea, headaches, burns on their skin. They returned to Japan, where they were diagnosed with acute radiation syndrome. One crew member, radio operator Aikichi Kuboyama, died 6 months later from radiation-related complications. The incident became an international scandal. Japan, the only nation to have suffered atomic attacks, was now dealing with American hydrogen bomb fallout contaminating its fishing fleet. Public outrage erupted, anti-nuclear movements gained momentum, and the Castle Bravo disaster became a symbol of the uncontrollable, unpredictable dangers of thermonuclear testing. Islanders on Rongelap, Rongerik and other atolls were evacuated, but not before they absorbed dangerous doses of radiation. Children played in the white ash that covered their villages, not knowing it was radioactive. People developed burns, thyroid diseases and cancers. Some suffered lifelong health problems. Entire communities were displaced, unable to return to their homes for decades. Even today, parts of the Marshall Islands remain contaminated, with radiation levels too high for safe habitation. Yet testing continued. The United States needed data. Each test provided information about weapon design, yield prediction, fallout patterns, blast effects, and electromagnetic pulses. Scientists refined their models, improved triggering mechanisms, and developed more efficient designs. The Castle series alone provided enough data to revolutionize thermonuclear weapon design, enabling smaller, lighter, more reliable bombs that could be delivered by aircraft or missiles. The Soviet Union, determined not to fall behind, conducted its own series of thermonuclear tests. Soviet testing was even more extensive and in some ways more reckless than American efforts. The most notorious Soviet test was Tsar Bomba, detonated on October 30th, 1961, over the Novaya Zemlya archipelago in the Arctic Ocean. Tsar Bomba was not just the largest nuclear weapon ever detonated by the Soviet Union, it was the largest nuclear explosion in human history, period. Tsar Bomba had a yield of approximately 50 megatons, though the bomb had been designed to deliver 100 megatons. Soviet scientists deliberately reduced the yield by replacing the uranium tamper with lead, cutting the fission contribution and limiting fallout. Even at half its design yield, Tsar Bomba was staggering in its power. The fireball alone was 5 miles in diameter, reaching nearly to the altitude of the bomber that dropped it. The pilot, Major Andrei Durnovtsev, had to execute a dramatic escape maneuver, dropping the bomb with a giant parachute to slow its descent and give the aircraft time to escape the blast radius. Even so, the shockwave nearly knocked the bomber out of the sky. The mushroom cloud rose 40 miles into the atmosphere, 7 times the height of Mount Everest. It was visible from 600 miles away. The flash of the explosion was seen in Norway, Finland and Greenland. The shockwave circled the Earth 3 times, detected by seismographs around the globe. Windows shattered 560 miles away in Finland. The thermal pulse was so intense that it could have caused third-degree burns to anyone within 60 miles who had direct line of sight to the blast. Tsar Bomba wasn't a practical weapon. It was too large, too heavy, and too cumbersome to be militarily useful. The bomb weighed 27 tons and required a specially modified Tu-95 bomber to carry it. No air force would deploy such a weapon in actual combat. It was a statement, a demonstration of Soviet technological prowess, and a propaganda tool meant to intimidate the West and the world. After proving they could build a bomb of such absurd size, the Soviets never built another one. Even they understood that Tsar Bomba was more symbol than weapon. But testing wasn't just about building bigger bombs. Much of the testing focused on refinement, miniaturization, and specialization. Scientists worked to develop hydrogen bombs small enough to fit on missiles, efficient enough to maximize yield relative to size, and reliable enough to survive years in storage and still detonate on demand. This required hundreds of tests, each slightly different, each providing incremental improvements. Some tests explored tactical thermonuclear weapons, smaller hydrogen bombs designed for battlefield use. The W-88 warhead, for example, was designed to deliver 475 kilotons from a compact package that could be mounted on submarine-launched missiles. Other tests examined neutron bombs, specialised thermonuclear weapons designed to maximise radiation output while minimising blast effects. The neutron bomb was intended to kill enemy soldiers with radiation, while leaving buildings and infrastructure relatively intact, a weapon that critics called the capitalist bomb because it preserved property while killing people. Still other tests focused on effects. What happens to electronics when exposed to the electromagnetic pulse from a thermonuclear explosion? How far does thermal radiation extend? What are the blast dynamics at different altitudes? These questions required testing at various heights, from underground detonations to atmospheric bursts to high-altitude tests. High-altitude tests revealed terrifying new effects. In 1962, the United States conducted a series of high-altitude nuclear tests over the Pacific, codenamed Operation Fishbowl. One test, Starfish Prime, detonated a 1.4 megaton warhead 250 miles above the Pacific Ocean. The explosion created an artificial aurora that lit up the night sky across vast areas. But more significantly, the electromagnetic pulse from the blast knocked out streetlights, damaged electrical equipment, and disrupted communications across Hawaii, nearly 900 miles away. This demonstrated that a single high-altitude nuclear detonation could disable electronics across an entire continent, crippling civilian infrastructure and military command systems simultaneously. Testing also served a strategic purpose beyond technical development. Each detonation was a signal. It demonstrated capability, warned adversaries, reassured allies, and maintained the credibility of deterrence. A successful test proved that your weapons worked, that your scientists were competent, and that your nuclear deterrent was not a bluff. Obvious failed test, on the other hand, could undermine confidence and invite aggression. Testing became a form of communication, a way to speak without words but with unmistakable clarity. International audiences watched closely. When France conducted its first hydrogen bomb test in 1968, it announced to the world that France was now a thermonuclear power, independent of American and Soviet arsenals. When China tested its first hydrogen bomb in 1967, just 32 months after its first fission bomb, Western intelligence agencies were shocked by the speed of Chinese progress. India's first nuclear test in 1974, though officially described as a peaceful nuclear explosion, clearly demonstrated nuclear weapon capability and shifted the strategic balance in South Asia. But testing came with terrible consequences. Radioactive fallout from atmospheric tests contaminated vast areas. Isotopes like strontium-90, cesium-137, and iodine-131 entered the food chain, accumulating in milk, crops, vegetables, and eventually human bones and tissues. Scientists began detecting elevated levels of radioactivity in children's teeth, collected as part of the Baby Tooth Survey, which documented the spread of strontium-90 from fallout into human populations. Cancer rates increased in communities near test sites, though the full extent of health impacts remained contested and often classified for decades. The Nevada test site, where the US conducted many of its atmospheric tests during the 1950s and early 1960s, became a public health disaster. Downwinders, people living downwind of the test site in Nevada, Utah, and Arizona, developed cancers, thyroid diseases, leukemia, and other radiation-related illnesses at alarming rates. For years, the government denied any connection, claiming the test was safe and that fallout levels were negligible. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that the government acknowledged the harm and established compensation programs for affected communities. Indigenous communities suffered particularly badly. The Western Shoshone people, whose ancestral lands included the Nevada test site, were exposed to repeated nuclear tests without adequate warning or protection. Their lands became sacrifice zones in the name of national security, contaminated by radiation that would persist for thousands of years. Similar stories played out in the Marshall Islands, where entire atolls were rendered uninhabitable, and in Kazakhstan, where the Soviet Semipalatinsk test site contaminated vast regions and exposed hundreds of thousands of people to dangerous radiation levels. By the early 1960s, public outcry over atmospheric testing grew louder. Anti-nuclear activists organised protests, petitions, and campaigns highlighting the health risks of fallout. Scientists, including many who had worked on nuclear weapons programs, warned of long-term environmental damage. Prominent figures like Linus Pauling, who would win the Nobel Peace Prize for his activism, argued that atmospheric testing was poisoning the planet and threatening future generations. Both superpowers began to realise that atmospheric testing was not only dangerous, it was unnecessary. Advances in computer modelling, underground testing techniques, and diagnostic instruments made it possible to study nuclear weapons without releasing radioactive fallout into the atmosphere. Underground tests could be contained, preventing the spread of contamination while still providing valuable data about weapon performance. In 1963, after years of negotiation, the United States, Soviet Union, and United Kingdom signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty, prohibiting nuclear tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. Testing moved underground, where explosions could be contained within deep shafts drilled into bedrock. Underground testing continued for decades. The US conducted 837 underground nuclear tests between 1963 and 1992. The Soviet Union conducted over 400. France, China, India, Pakistan and North Korea all conducted underground tests as well. But underground testing, while safer than atmospheric testing, was not without problems. Some tests vented, accidentally releasing radioactive gases when containment failed. Others caused seismic disturbances that residents miles away could feel, and even contained tests left long-term environmental contamination, with radioactive materials sealed underground but persisting for millennia. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, CTBT, adopted by the United Nations in 1996, prohibits all nuclear explosions for any purpose, civilian or military, above or below ground. It's a comprehensive ban on testing that, if fully implemented, would end nuclear testing permanently. But the treaty hasn't been ratified by all nuclear-capable states. The United States signed but never ratified it. China signed but never ratified it. India, Pakistan and North Korea never signed at all. And Russia, while having ratified the treaty, has indicated it may withdraw if the US doesn't ratify. Today, testing has largely stopped. The major nuclear powers maintain voluntary moratoriums on testing. The last US test was in 1992. The Soviet Union's final test was in 1990. France continued until 1996. China's last test was also in 1996. But North Korea, the world's newest nuclear power, has conducted 6 nuclear tests between 2006 and 2017, the most recent claiming to be a hydrogen bomb. Even without testing, the knowledge gained from decades of explosions remains embedded in nuclear arsenals. Modern nuclear weapons are descendants of those tests, refined through simulations and data collected from over 2,000 nuclear detonations conducted worldwide. Supercomputers now model nuclear explosions with astonishing accuracy, using data from historical tests to predict how weapons will perform. Scientists can refine designs, test new concepts, and maintain existing arsenals without detonating a single bomb. Testing turned the hydrogen bomb from a theoretical possibility into a functional, deployable, reliable weapon. It provided the data needed to build smaller, more efficient, more predictable devices. But it also left scars, environmental, medical and psychological. Islands remain uninhabitable, communities remain contaminated, radiation persists in soils, water and ecosystems, and the legacy of testing serves as a grim reminder that even when hydrogen bombs aren't used in war, their development carries a terrible cost. The fallout, both literal and metaphorical, endures long after the explosions have faded. While testing proved that hydrogen bombs worked, and deterrence theory explained why they shouldn't be used, strategic doctrine determined how they would be deployed, targeted and integrated into military planning. This was the Cold War chessboard, a global game where moves were calculated in megatons, response times measured in minutes, and the ultimate stakes was civilization itself. The hydrogen bomb didn't just change tactics, it rewrote the entire logic of military strategy, forcing planners to think in ways no general in human history had ever thought before. At the heart of Cold War nuclear strategy was a simple, terrifying problem. How do you fight a war when the first shot could end the world? Traditional military doctrine assumed that wars had phases: opening engagements, escalation, pitched battles, eventual victory or defeat. Commanders had time to assess situations, adjust tactics, reinforce positions and negotiate settlements. But nuclear war offered no such progression. There was no time for mobilization, no opportunity for diplomacy once the missiles launched, and no clear definition of victory. Strategic doctrine had to account for this unprecedented reality. The earliest US nuclear strategy, developed in the late 1940s and early 1950s, was relatively crude. It focused on massive retaliation, the idea that any Soviet aggression, even a conventional military attack in Europe or Asia, would be met with an overwhelming nuclear response targeting Soviet cities and industrial centres. This was deterrence at its most blunt. If the Soviet Union invaded Western Europe with conventional forces, the US would respond by launching hydrogen bombs against Moscow, Leningrad and other major Soviet cities. The threat was clear, simple, and absolutely terrifying. But massive retaliation had serious problems. It lacked flexibility, offering no proportional response to limited aggression. It was all or nothing. If the Soviets made a small move, a border incursion, a blockade, a proxy war intervention, would the US really launch a full-scale thermonuclear war? And if the US did launch, the Soviets would certainly retaliate, destroying American cities in return. The strategy seemed incredible, literally not credible. If deterrence was about convincing your enemy you would follow through on your threats, massive retaliation was starting to look like an empty bluff. Who would risk the destruction of New York, Washington and Los Angeles to defend West Berlin? By the early 1960s, American strategists began questioning massive retaliation. The most prominent critic was Robert McNamara, who became Secretary of Defense under President John F. Kennedy. McNamara, a former businessman and systems analyst, brought a cold, calculating approach to nuclear strategy. He argued that the US needed options, not just all-or-nothing annihilation. This led to the development of flexible response, a doctrine that became official NATO policy in 1967. Flexible response argued that the US should be able to respond proportionally to aggression, using conventional forces, tactical nuclear weapons, or strategic hydrogen bombs depending on the nature and scale of the threat. If the Soviets invaded Western Europe with conventional forces, NATO would first respond conventionally. If NATO couldn't hold, it might use tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield. Only if the situation escalated beyond control would strategic thermonuclear weapons be employed. The goal was to provide decision-makers with a range of options, preventing a situation where the only choice was between surrender and Armageddon. But flexible response introduced new complexities and dangers. If the US used even a small tactical nuclear weapon in response to a Soviet invasion, would the Soviets interpret that as a limited strike and respond proportionally? Or would they see it as the beginning of total nuclear war and launch their full arsenal preemptively? The risk of escalation, rapid and uncontrollable escalation toward full thermonuclear exchange, became the nightmare scenario that haunted strategists. Once nuclear weapons were used, even in a limited fashion, the psychological and political barriers to further use would crumble. Military commanders facing battlefield losses might request authorization for more nuclear strikes. Political leaders, under immense pressure and with limited information, might authorize larger weapons. Each side, fearing that the other was about to escalate, might escalate preemptively. The process could spiral out of control within hours, moving from a single tactical nuclear strike to a full exchange of strategic hydrogen bombs. This concern led to the concept of escalation dominance, the idea that the US needed enough nuclear capability at every level of conflict to deter Soviet escalation at that level. If the Soviets used a tactical nuke, the US needed more and better tactical nukes. If the Soviets threatened a limited strategic strike, the US needed overwhelming strategic forces to make such a strike pointless. The goal was to convince the Soviets that no matter how they escalated, the US could match or exceed their response, making escalation futile. But escalation dominance required enormous arsenals. By the 1970s and 1980s, both superpowers had built thousands upon thousands of nuclear weapons deployed across a bewildering variety of platforms. This diversity gave rise to the nuclear triad, the three-part delivery system that became the cornerstone of strategic nuclear forces. Bombers, land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs. Each leg of the triad had distinct characteristics, advantages, and vulnerabilities. Together they provided redundancy, ensuring that even if one component was destroyed in a first strike, the other two could still retaliate. Strategic bombers like the B-52 Stratofortress and later the B-1 Lancer and B-2 Spirit could carry multiple hydrogen bombs and cruise missiles. Bombers had several advantages. They could be launched on warning, getting airborne before enemy missiles arrived. They could be recalled if a crisis de-escalated, providing flexibility that missiles lacked. They could carry large payloads, including bombs with yields ranging from kilotons to megatons, and they could use terrain-following flight profiles and electronic countermeasures to evade enemy air defences. But bombers were slow, taking hours to reach targets. They were vulnerable to advanced air defence systems, especially as Soviet surface-to-air missiles and interceptor aircraft improved. The B-52, introduced in 1955, became the workhorse of the American bomber fleet. By the 1980s, modified B-52s could carry air-launched cruise missiles, ALCMs, standoff weapons that allowed bombers to strike targets without entering heavily defended airspace. Each ALCM carried a nuclear warhead and could fly hundreds of miles, using terrain-following guidance to avoid radar detection. A single B-52 could carry 20 ALCMs, making it a flying arsenal capable of destroying multiple cities. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, revolutionized nuclear strategy. Unlike bombers, ICBMs could strike targets on another continent within 30 minutes of launch. They followed a ballistic trajectory, arcing high above the atmosphere before plunging back to Earth at speeds exceeding Mach 20. At those speeds, no existing defense system could intercept them reliably. ICBMs were the ultimate first strike and second strike weapon, fast, unstoppable, and terrifying. The Soviet Union launched the first ICBM, the R-7 Semyorka, in 1957, the same missile that launched Sputnik into orbit. The achievement shocked American military planners, who realized that Soviet missiles could now reach American cities with virtually no warning. This triggered the missile gap panic, fears that the Soviet Union was rapidly building a massive ICBM fleet that would give them strategic superiority. The missile gap turned out to be largely imaginary, based on inflated estimates of Soviet capabilities, but the fear drove American ICBM development to new heights. The United States developed its own ICBM force rapidly. The Atlas missile, America's first operational ICBM, was deployed in 1959. The Titan missile followed, larger and more powerful. But early ICBMs were liquid-fueled, which meant they required time-consuming fueling procedures before launch. Liquid fuel was also highly corrosive and volatile, making these missiles difficult to maintain and dangerous to handle. And early ICBMs were stored in above-ground facilities or soft silos, making them vulnerable to attack. By the 1960s, both superpowers developed solid-fuel ICBMs, which could be stored ready to launch in hardened underground silos. Solid fuel was stable, safe, and could be ignited instantly. The US Minuteman missile, introduced in 1962, became the backbone of the American ICBM force. Minuteman missiles were deployed in reinforced concrete silos scattered across the American heartland in Montana, North Dakota, Wyoming, and other states. Each silo was hardened to withstand nearby nuclear explosions, with thick concrete walls, blast doors, and shock-absorbing mountings. Minuteman III, introduced in 1970 and still in service, today represented a major advance. It could carry multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, or MIRVs. A single Minuteman III missile carried 3 warheads, each capable of being aimed at a different target hundreds of miles apart. MIRVs multiplied the destructive capacity of each missile dramatically. A fleet of 500 Minuteman III missiles could engage 1/500 targets, far more than would be possible with single warhead missiles. MIRVs made missile defences nearly useless, as each interceptor could only stop one warhead, and a single missile carried multiple warheads plus decoys. The Soviet Union developed its own advanced ICBMs, including the formidable SS-18 Satan. Satan was the largest and most powerful ICBM ever deployed, capable of carrying 10 warheads, each with a yield of several hundred kilotons. A single Satan missile could destroy an entire field of American missile silos, making it the ultimate first-strike weapon. The US deployed 1,000 Minuteman missiles at the height of the Cold War. The Soviet Union deployed over 1,400 ICBMs, many larger and more powerful than their American counterparts. But ICBMs had a critical vulnerability: they were stationary. Once a missile silo was located by reconnaissance satellites, and both superpowers had comprehensive satellite coverage, it could be targeted. This created the fear of a decapitating first strike, where one side could destroy the other's ICBM force before it launched. In theory, if you had enough accurate warheads and launched them all simultaneously, you could eliminate the enemy's land-based missiles before they could retaliate. This possibility introduced dangerous instability. It created a use-them-or-lose-them mentality, where leaders in a crisis might feel pressured to launch their ICBMs before they were destroyed. To mitigate this risk, both superpowers explored mobile ICBMs and rail-launched systems. The Soviet Union deployed several mobile ICBM systems, including the SS-24 Scalpel and SS-25 Sickle, which were mounted on massive transporter erector launcher TEL vehicles and moved continuously to prevent targeting. The US briefly experimented with rail-mobile ICBMs, planning to deploy peacekeeper missiles on trains that would circulate through the American rail network, making them impossible to target. However, mobile ICBMs proved expensive, difficult to maintain, and politically controversial, especially the idea of nuclear-armed trains rolling through American towns. The solution to ICBM vulnerability, the true guarantee of second strike capability, was the submarine. Ballistic missile submarines, SSBNs, became the ultimate survivable deterrent. They operated in stealth, moving silently through the world's oceans, invisible to satellites, radar, and most detection systems. Each submarine carried 16 to 24 submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, each capable of delivering multiple thermonuclear warheads. A single Ohio-class submarine, the mainstay of the US SSBN fleet, carried more destructive power than all the bombs dropped in World War II combined, including the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. SSBNs operated on patrol cycles, spending months submerged, hidden beneath the waves. Their exact locations were closely guarded secrets, unknown even to most military commanders. Submarines received targeting updates and command messages via extremely low-frequency ELF radio signals that could penetrate deep into the ocean. But otherwise they operated in radio silence, invisible and invulnerable. This made them nearly impossible to target in a first strike. Even if an enemy destroyed every ICBM silo and bomber base, the submarines would survive, ensuring that retaliation was guaranteed. The US Navy deployed its first SSBNs in 1960, the George Washington class, armed with Polaris missiles. These early SLBMs had relatively short ranges and modest yields, but they represented a revolution in deterrence. Later generations of American SSBNs, including the Ohio class introduced in the 1980s, carried Trident missiles with ranges exceeding 4,000 miles, and accuracies measured in hundreds of feet. Each Trident missile carried up to 8 W-88 warheads, each with a yield of 475 kilotons. An Ohio-class submarine carried 24 Trident missiles, meaning each submarine could engage nearly 200 separate targets. The Soviet Union developed its own SSBN fleet, including the massive Typhoon-class submarines, the largest submarines ever built. Typhoons displaced over 48,000 tons submerged, larger than most World War II battleships. They were designed to operate under Arctic ice, breaking through to launch their missiles from remote, inaccessible regions where American anti-submarine forces couldn't reach them. Soviet SSBNs carried R-29 and R-39 missiles, comparable to American SLBMs in range and payload. Both fleets maintained constant patrols, ensuring that at any given moment several submarines were at sea, armed and ready to launch. This continuous presence formed the backbone of deterrence. No first strike, no matter how successful, could eliminate the SSBN force. Retaliation was inevitable, and because SSBNs could launch their missiles from anywhere in the world's oceans, there was no way to defend against them. They represented the ultimate guarantee of mutual assured destruction. Delivery systems weren't just about getting hydrogen bombs to targets, they were about signalling, credibility, and deterrence. The bomber fleet signalled flexibility and restraint, the ability to launch on warning but recall if necessary. The ICBM force signalled readiness and speed, the ability to retaliate within minutes. The submarine fleet signalled survivability and inevitability, the promise that even total surprise attack couldn't prevent retaliation. Together, they formed a triad that covered every scenario, every threat, every possible failure mode. If one leg of the triad was compromised, the other two remained intact. This redundancy made deterrence credible, but credibility required constant maintenance and modernization. Missiles had to be tested regularly to ensure they worked. Submarines had to be rotated through maintenance cycles to keep them seaworthy. Bomber crews had to train constantly to remain proficient. Command and control systems had to be hardened, protected, and updated. The nuclear triad wasn't a static arsenal sitting in storage. It was a living, breathing system that consumed vast resources and demanded constant attention. By the height of the Cold War, the United States maintained over 1,000 ICBMs, 400 submarine-launched missiles across 18 SSBMs, and hundreds of bombers, all armed with thermonuclear weapons. The Soviet Union had comparable numbers, with over 1,400 ICBMs, hundreds of SLBMs, and a substantial bomber force. Together, these arsenals represented tens of thousands of nuclear warheads, enough to destroy human civilization many times over, and yet, they were never used. They remained tools of deterrence, weapons whose purpose was to prevent their own use. The delivery systems became symbols, icons of Cold War power. The ICBM represented speed, precision, and unstoppable force. The bomber represented tradition, flexibility, and human judgment. The submarine represented the silent, invisible promise of retaliation that could never be stopped. Together, they formed the machinery that kept the hydrogen bomb from ever exploding in anger. They were instruments of a doctrine that said the best way to win was never to play. And for decades, that strange, paradoxical logic held the world together. Strategic doctrine also grappled with the nightmare question that no one wanted to answer. What would actually happen if deterrence failed? What would a nuclear war look like? How many would die? Could civilization survive? Throughout the Cold War, military planners, scientists, and government officials wrestled with these questions, producing studies, simulations, and war plans that range from coldly analytical to apocalyptically grim. The Single Integrated Operational Plan, or SIOP, was the US military's actual war plan for nuclear conflict. The SIOP was among the most classified documents in existence, a detailed blueprint for Armageddon. It identified thousands of targets across the Soviet Union and its allies, military bases, missile silos, command centres, submarine pens, airfields, industrial facilities, transportation hubs, and cities. Each target was assigned one or more warheads based on its hardness, size, and strategic importance. Hardened targets like missile silos might require multiple warheads to ensure destruction. Cities, unfortunately much softer targets, required far fewer. Early versions of the SIOP were blunt instruments. SIOP 62, the first operational plan, called for launching virtually the entire US nuclear arsenal, over 3,200 nuclear weapons in a single coordinated strike. The plan made little distinction between military and civilian targets. Soviet cities would be hit not just because they were industrial centres, but because destroying them would eliminate the Soviet Union's ability to function as a nation. The estimated casualties from SIOP 62 were staggering. Over 200 million dead in the Soviet Union and China within the first few hours. Radioactive fallout would kill millions more across Europe, Asia, and potentially the Northern Hemisphere. Later versions of the SIOP became more sophisticated, offering options for limited strikes, flexible targeting, and escalation control. SIOP 63 introduced the concept of withholds, intentionally sparing certain targets to provide bargaining leverage during a conflict. The idea was that even in the middle of a nuclear war, there might be opportunities for negotiation, chances to signal restraint and encourage the enemy to do the same. Whether this logic would actually work in the chaos and terror of nuclear combat was, thankfully, never tested. Targeting doctrine evolved over time. Early plans focused on counter-value targeting, aiming at cities and industrial capacity to maximize damage to the enemy's society and economy. The logic was simple: threaten what the enemy values most. If Soviet leaders knew that a nuclear war would annihilate their population and erase their civilization, they would never start one. But counter-value targeting was morally horrifying. It meant planning, in cold detail, to kill hundreds of millions of civilians who had no role in starting the war. By the 1970s, strategists shifted toward counterforce targeting, focusing on destroying enemy military capabilities rather than cities. The logic was that if you could destroy the enemy's missiles, bombers and submarines before they launched, you could limit damage to your own cities. Counterforce seemed more humane, more strategic, and more aligned with the principles of just war theory. But it introduced a dangerous instability. If both sides believed they could destroy the other's nuclear forces in a first strike, the incentive to strike first in a crisis increased dramatically. Counterforce made nuclear war seem potentially winnable, which paradoxically made it more likely. The Soviets developed their own targeting doctrines, though less is known about their detailed plans. Soviet military writings emphasize surprise, overwhelming force, and rapid escalation. Soviet planners believed that nuclear war, while catastrophic, could be fought and potentially won if initiated quickly and decisively. This belief terrified American strategists, who worried that in a crisis, Soviet leaders might see a preemptive strike as their best option. Soviet doctrine also emphasized survival and recovery, with extensive civil defense programs, hardened bunkers, and plans for relocating leadership and industry. Both superpowers developed launch-on-warning systems designed to detect incoming missiles and authorize retaliation before those missiles reach their targets. This compressed decision-making timelines to mere minutes. If satellites detected a launch, ground-based radar confirmed it, and military leaders advised that an attack was underway, the president had perhaps 10 to 15 minutes to decide whether to launch a counterstrike. There was no time for deliberation, consultation, or verification. Leaders had to trust the systems, trust the data, and trust that the warning was real, not a false alarm. The pressure on leaders in such a scenario would be unimaginable. Decide too slowly, and your missiles might be destroyed in their silos, leaving you unable to retaliate. Decide too quickly based on a false alarm, and you've just started a nuclear war by mistake. And once missiles were launched, there was no calling them back. ICBMs don't have recall mechanisms. They fly their programmed trajectories, detonate on schedule, and end millions of lives in seconds. Launch on warning created a hair trigger situation where the world could go from peace to Armageddon in less time than it takes to microwave dinner. Both superpowers knew this was dangerous, but both also believed that the ability to launch under attack was necessary to maintain deterrence. If the enemy knew you could only retaliate after absorbing a first strike, they might be tempted to try a decapitating blow, hoping to destroy your leadership and prevent any response. Launch on warning ensured that no such gamble would succeed. Command and control became an obsession. Both superpowers built elaborate systems to ensure that nuclear weapons could be launched even after a surprise attack. The US constructed the National Military Command Center, deep beneath the Pentagon, hardened command bunkers at NORAD inside Cheyenne Mountain, and airborne command posts that circled continuously aboard modified Boeing 747s. These doomsday planes carried battle staffs, communications equipment, and all the codes needed to launch nuclear weapons. If Washington was destroyed, if the Pentagon was vaporized, if every fixed command center was obliterated, the airborne command post could still coordinate retaliation. The Soviets built similar systems, including massive underground bunkers outside Moscow and their own airborne command posts. They also developed automated systems, including the rumoured dead hand or perimeter system, allegedly designed to launch a retaliatory strike automatically if Soviet leadership was killed and certain conditions were met. Whether dead hand actually existed as described remains uncertain, but the concept itself reveals the logic of assured retaliation. Even if you killed every Soviet leader, even if you destroyed Moscow and every command centre, the missiles would still launch. Strategic doctrine also addressed damage limitation. The idea that if nuclear war became inevitable, the goal should be to minimise casualties and destruction. This led to civil defence programmes, fallout shelters, evacuation plans, and public information campaigns teaching citizens how to survive a nuclear attack. During the 1950s and early 1960s, American schoolchildren practiced duck and cover drills, taught to hide under desks if they saw a nuclear flash. Civil defense pamphlets explained how to build fallout shelters, stockpile food and water, and recognize radiation sickness. In practice, these efforts were largely symbolic, psychological measures meant to give the public a sense of agency in a situation where they had none. A full-scale thermonuclear exchange would overwhelm any civil defense measures. Fallout shelters might save lives in areas distant from blast zones, but they couldn't save cities targeted by multiple megaton warheads. Duck and cover couldn't protect against thermal radiation that could set clothing on fire miles from ground zero. And no amount of preparation could address the long-term consequences. Nuclear winter, ecosystem collapse, agricultural failure, and societal breakdown. Still, the program served a political purpose. They demonstrated that the government was doing something, that survival was possible, that nuclear war wasn't simply the end of everything. Whether anyone truly believed this remains debatable, but in a world where the alternative was acknowledging complete helplessness, civil defense offered a comforting illusion of control. Throughout the Cold War, strategic doctrine remained a strange blend of rationality and madness. On one hand, it was meticulously calculated, supported by complex models, computer simulations and war games. On the other hand, it was fundamentally absurd, planning in elaborate detail for a war that would destroy the planners, their nations, and possibly the species. The hydrogen bomb forced strategists to think the unthinkable, to plan for scenarios where victory was indistinguishable from defeat, and to build strategies around weapons they desperately hoped never to use. The doctrine worked, at least in the narrow sense that no hydrogen bombs were ever used in anger. Whether this was due to the brilliance of deterrence theory, the skill and restraint of leaders, or sheer statistical luck remains unknowable. But for nearly 5 decades, the hydrogen bomb sat at the centre of global strategy, shaping alliances, dictating military spending, defining what it meant to be a superpower, and hanging over every diplomatic crisis like a sword suspended by the thinnest thread. The hydrogen bomb was the ultimate strategic weapon, one whose greatest power lay not in its use but in its restraint. It was a weapon designed never to explode, a threat meant never to be carried out, a promise of annihilation that worked only as long as it remained a promise. And in that dark, paradoxical space, humanity learned to live, to plan, and somehow to survive. But beneath the logic of deterrence, the sophistication of delivery systems, the carefully calibrated doctrines, and the endless planning, darker question lingered like radiation in the atmosphere. What if deterrence failed? What if miscalculation, accident, technical error, or simple human madness led to the launch of hydrogen bombs? Throughout the Cold War, humanity came terrifyingly, heart-stoppingly close to finding out. And each close call revealed just how fragile the architecture of deterrence really was, how thin the margin between survival and extinction, how much the fate of civilization rested on individual judgment calls made under impossible pressure in mere seconds. The most famous near miss, seared into historical memory, was the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. It remains the closest the world has ever come to full-scale thermonuclear war. The crisis began when American U-2 reconnaissance flights discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, just 90 miles from the Florida coast. These weren't just ordinary missiles. They were medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles, capable of striking American cities with virtually no warning, compressing decision time to mere minutes and rendering much of the US early warning system useless. President Kennedy faced an impossible choice: allow the missiles to remain, fundamentally altering the strategic balance and giving the Soviets a dagger pointed at America's heart, or take action to remove them, risking confrontation that could escalate to World War III. Kennedy chose a middle path, a naval blockade, euphemistically called a quarantine to avoid the legal implications of an act of war. US Navy ships formed a ring around Cuba, with orders to stop and search any Soviet vessels approaching the island. The crisis escalated rapidly, far more rapidly than either side anticipated. The US military went to DEFCON 2, the highest state of readiness short of actual war. Strategic bombers armed with hydrogen bombs took to the skies, circling in holding patterns ready to proceed to Soviet targets if ordered. ICBM crews went on full alert, keys inserted, fingers hovering over launch buttons. Submarine crews loaded nuclear torpedoes. The machinery of annihilation was primed, tense, waiting. Soviet ships approached the quarantine line. Would they stop? Would they try to run the blockade? Would Soviet submarines escorting the ships fire on American destroyers? In Moscow, some Soviet generals urged a preemptive strike. In Washington, military advisors pushed Kennedy to invade Cuba immediately. Both leaders faced immense pressure from hawkish advisors who believed that backing down would be seen as weakness, but the other side only respected strength, that now was the time to act decisively. For 13 days, the world held its breath. Diplomats scrambled through back channels, military forces manoeuvred, and the distance between peace and annihilation shrank to almost nothing. Then, on October 27, 1962, the crisis reached its absolute peak, a day that historians now call Black Saturday. That morning, a US U-2 spy plane piloted by Major Rudolph Anderson was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile, killing Anderson instantly. The shoot-down was unauthorized by Moscow, a decision made by local Soviet commanders who believed they were under attack. But in Washington, it looked like deliberate escalation. Military advisors told Kennedy that the US had to respond, that not retaliating would signal weakness and invite further aggression. Plans were drawn up for airstrikes against Cuban air defense sites, strikes that would almost certainly kill Soviet personnel and trigger wider war. At almost the same moment, another U-2 strayed accidentally into Soviet airspace over Siberia. Soviet MiG fighters scrambled to intercept it. US F-102 fighters, armed with nuclear air-to-air missiles, scrambled to protect the U-2. For several minutes, American and Soviet fighters maneuvered near each other, each armed with nuclear weapons, each operating under rules of engagement that included authorization to use those weapons under certain circumstances, a single mistake, a single misidentified radar contact, a single fighter pilot's itchy trigger finger, and nuclear weapons could have been used. Meanwhile, beneath the Caribbean waves, a drama was unfolding that wouldn't be fully known for decades. Soviet submarines, diesel-electric Foxtrot-class boats, armed with nuclear torpedoes, were attempting to reach Cuba. These submarines, operating far from home in tropical waters, were suffering terribly. Their batteries were depleting. Air conditioning had failed. Temperatures inside reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Crew members were collapsing from heat exhaustion and carbon dioxide poisoning. Communications with Moscow had been lost days earlier, and now US Navy destroyers were hunting them, dropping practice depth charges to force them to surface. On one submarine, B-59, conditions had become desperate. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, exhausted and under unbearable stress, believed that war had already begun. The depth charges sounded like the opening salvos of World War III. Cut off from communications, he had no way to know that they were merely warning signals, not attacks. Savitsky made a decision. He would use the nuclear torpedo. One nuclear explosion would destroy the pursuing American ships and announce Soviet resolve. The order was given. The torpedo was prepared for launch, but Soviet procedure required that 3 officers agree before a nuclear weapon could be used: the captain, the political officer, and the second in command. The second in command on B-59 was Vasily Arkhipov, and Arkhipov said no. Arkhipov argued against launch. He pointed out that they had no confirmation that war had begun. He noted that the depth charges were designed to signal, not to destroy. He urged restraint, calm, patience. The debate inside that sweltering, oxygen-depleted submarine was fierce. Officers shouted at each other, tempers flared, but Arkhipov held, firm. And because Soviet procedure required unanimity, the launch was cancelled. B-59 surfaced peacefully, and the crisis continued. Only decades later did the world learn how close it had come to nuclear war. Historians now agree that if Arkhipov had agreed with Savitsky, if he had authorized the launch, the nuclear torpedo would have destroyed several American ships. The US almost certainly would have retaliated, probably with nuclear depth charges against Soviet submarines. Moscow, already on edge, might have interpreted this as the beginning of general war and launched its strategic forces. The crisis could have spiraled from one submarine's decision to full thermonuclear exchange within hours. One man, one decision, one moment of skepticism and restraint. That's how close the world came to ending. But the Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't the only close call, not by a long measure. Throughout the Cold War, accidents, false alarms and near misses occurred with terrifying regularity, each one a reminder that the system designed to prevent nuclear war was fragile, vulnerable to error and dependent on luck. In 1979, a training tape was accidentally loaded into NORAD's early warning system at Cheyenne Mountain. The tape simulated a massive Soviet missile attack, showing hundreds of ICBMs and SLBMs heading toward the United States. For several minutes, duty officers believed the attack was real. Bomber crews raced to their aircraft. Missile crews went on full alert. The National Emergency Airborne Command Post took off, ready to coordinate retaliation. Zbigniew Brzezinski, President Carter's national security advisor, was awakened with the news that nuclear war had begun. Brzezinski was preparing to call President Carter to recommend immediate retaliation when a second call came through. The attack was a false alarm. A technician had mistakenly loaded a training scenario into the live warning system. The incoming missiles didn't exist. For 6 minutes, the United States had been on the brink of launching its nuclear forces based on data from a training tape. 6 minutes between a clerical error and the end of civilization. Another incident in 1980 was even more bizarre. A computer chip failure at NORAD caused the system to randomly generate false missile detections. On 3 separate occasions over the course of a few months, the system indicated that Soviet missiles had been launched. Each time, bomber crews prepared for takeoff. Each time, missile crews went on alert. Each time, officers scrambled to verify the data before someone made an irreversible decision. And each time, with minutes to spare, the false alarm was identified. A 46-cent computer chip failing randomly had nearly triggered World War III 3 times. The Soviets had their own close calls, some even more frightening. On September 26, 1983, Soviet early warning satellites detected what appeared to be a US missile launch. The system indicated that 5 Minuteman ICBMs had been launched from bases in the United States and were heading toward the Soviet Union. This was exactly the scenario Soviet military planners feared, a decapitating first strike designed to destroy Soviet leadership before they could respond. The duty officer that night was Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov. Soviet protocol required him to immediately report the detection to his superiors, who would then advise the Soviet leadership to launch a retaliatory strike. Time was critical. If the detected missiles were real, they would reach Soviet targets in less than 20 minutes. Every second of delay reduced the time available for retaliation. Petrov's job was simple: report the detection and let the chain of command handle the decision. But Petrov hesitated. Something didn't make sense. Why would the Americans launch only 5 missiles? If they were initiating a first strike, wouldn't they launch hundreds, trying to destroy as much of the Soviet arsenal as possible? 5 missiles seemed wrong, inconsistent with any rational attack plan. Petrov suspected a malfunction, though he had no proof. The satellites were new, installed just weeks earlier. They might have bugs, glitches, or design flaws. Petrov made a judgment call. He reported the detection as a false alarm, a system malfunction. He was wrong. His career would be over, possibly worse. If he was right, and he reported it as an attack, and Soviet leaders launched in response, he would be responsible for starting World War III. The pressure was unimaginable, and Petrov chose skepticism over protocol. He was right. The satellites had mistaken sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds for missile launches. The attack was an illusion, an artifact of sensors misinterpreting natural phenomena. But if Petrov had followed procedure, if he had reported the detection as real, Soviet leaders might have ordered retaliation. And once Soviet missiles launched, American systems would have detected them, triggering US retaliation. The cascade would have been unstoppable. Once again, one person's judgment, made under crushing pressure in seconds, had prevented nuclear war. Petrov wasn't rewarded for his decision. In fact, he was reprimanded for failing to properly document the incident. He retired from the military in poor health, his role in preventing catastrophe unknown for decades. Only in the 1990s, after the Cold War ended, did his story emerge. Historians began calling him the man who saved the world. And while that might be hyperbole, it's not much of an exaggeration. These incidents revealed a terrifying truth. Deterrence relied not just on strategy, doctrine, and technology, but on individual judgment, technical reliability, and sheer luck. Systems failed regularly. Humans misinterpreted data frequently. Accidents happened constantly. And in a world where nuclear weapons stood ready to launch within minutes, where decision timelines were compressed to seconds, where the fog of war could obscure reality, there was virtually no margin for error. The most frightening aspect was that these were just the incidents we know about. How many other close calls occurred that remain classified? How many times did a technician catch an error just in time? How many times did a commander decide to wait for confirmation instead of acting immediately? How many times did luck, pure random chance, intervene to prevent catastrophe? The Cuban Missile Crisis also demonstrated another terrifying reality. Once a crisis begins, it develops its own momentum. Events cascade faster than leaders can control. Local commanders make decisions that escalate situations. Technical systems fail at the worst possible moments. Communication breaks down. Misunderstandings multiply. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev, throughout the crisis, found themselves struggling to maintain control, to prevent their own military forces from triggering wider war through unauthorized actions. The lesson was clear. Deterrence was fragile. It depended on rational decision-making, but crises create conditions where rationality is hard to maintain. It depended on clear communication, but war creates confusion and uncertainty. It depended on technology, but technology fails. And it depended on time, but nuclear weapons had compressed time to a point where there was barely enough to think, let alone to verify, consult, or reconsider. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, both superpowers recognized that they had come within a hair's breadth of mutual annihilation. The experience sobered leaders on both sides. Kennedy and Khrushchev established a direct communication line, the famous hotline, actually a teletype system that allowed leaders to communicate directly during crises, reducing the risk of misunderstanding. They also began discussing arms control, looking for ways to reduce the risks inherent in the nuclear standoff. But the close calls continued. In 1983, NATO conducted a military exercise, called Able Archer 83, simulating the transition from conventional war to nuclear war in Europe. The exercise was realistic, using actual NATO command posts, encrypted communications, and procedures that closely mimicked real nuclear release protocols. Soviet intelligence, already paranoid that the West was planning a surprise attack, watched the exercise closely. Some Soviet officials believed that Able Archer might be cover for an actual first strike, that NATO was using the exercise to mask genuine preparations for war. Soviet forces went on heightened alert. Some nuclear forces were moved to forward positions. For several days, the two superpowers teetered on the edge, each believing the other might be preparing to strike. Only after the exercise ended, and NATO forces returned to normal readiness, did tensions ease. Later analysis suggested that the Soviet reaction was more serious than Western intelligence realized at the time. Once again, misunderstanding and worst case. Thinking had brought the world frighteningly close to disaster. By the 1980s, both superpowers recognized that the arms race had reached absurd, dangerous levels. Each side had enough warheads to destroy the other many times over. Yet they kept building more, driven by the logic of deterrence that said any perceived weakness might invite aggression. The arsenals had taken on a life of their own, growing beyond any rational strategic requirement, sustained by institutional momentum, military-industrial interests and political fears of being seen as weak. This recognition led to serious arms control efforts. The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, Saltian II, aimed to cap the number of warheads and delivery systems. SALTOI, signed in 1972, limited the number of ICBMs and SLBMs each side could deploy. It also included the Anti-Ballistic Missile, ABM, Treaty, which strictly limited missile defense systems. The ABM Treaty was based on the counterintuitive logic that defense is destabilized, deterrence. If one side could defend itself against nuclear attack, it might be tempted to launch a first strike, believing it could survive retaliation. Mutual vulnerability, strange as it seemed, was actually stabilizing. Both sides had to remain vulnerable to ensure neither was tempted to strike first. SALT II, signed in 1979, imposed further limits on strategic forces. but it was never ratified by the US Senate, a casualty of worsening US-Soviet relations following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Still, both sides generally adhered to its provisions informally, recognising that unconstrained arms racing served no one's interests. The most significant breakthrough came in 1987 with the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces INF Treaty. INF eliminated an entire class of nuclear missiles, ground-launched missiles with ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometres. These missiles, deployed in Europe by both NATO and the Soviet Union, had compressed warning times to mere minutes and raised fears of rapid escalation from conventional conflict to nuclear war. The INF Treaty required the destruction of nearly 2,700 missiles, verified through intrusive on-site inspections. It was the first time nuclear powers had actually reduced their arsenals, not just limited their growth. These treaties didn't end the nuclear arms race, but they slowed it, creating a framework for dialogue and reducing some of the most destabilizing weapons. They represented a recognition, born from decades of living on the edge of annihilation, that the arms race had gone too far, that accumulating more weapons didn't increase security, and that cooperation, even between adversaries, was necessary for survival. Yet even as arms control progressed, new technologies and strategies emerged that challenged the foundations of deterrence. President Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, announced in 1983 and popularly known as Star Wars, proposed building a space-based missile defense system capable of intercepting Soviet ICBMs in flight. Reagan presented SDI as a way to make nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete, to move beyond deterrence based on mutual vulnerability toward defense-based security. The Soviets viewed SDI as an existential threat. If the US could defend itself against nuclear attack, even partially, it would undermine MAD and potentially enable a first strike strategy. Soviet leaders feared that an American leadership, confident in its defences, might be tempted to launch a preemptive nuclear war, gambling that SDI could blunt Soviet retaliation enough to make the gamble worthwhile. The logic of deterrence depended on mutual vulnerability. Defences, even imperfect ones, broke that logic. SDI drove a wedge into arms control negotiations. The Soviets demanded that SDI be abandoned as a condition for further reductions in offensive forces. The Reagan administration refused, insisting that defensive systems were inherently moral and stabilizing. The debate was never fully resolved. SDI proved far more difficult technically than its proponents imagined. The challenges of intercepting dozens or hundreds of missiles, each carrying multiple warheads and decoys, travelling at hypersonic speeds, were enormous. Despite billions in spending, SDI never became operational. But SDI's legacy lived on. It demonstrated that new technologies could destabilize deterrence, creating uncertainties and fears that led to renewed arms racing. And it showed that even sincere attempts to move beyond MAD, to create defences that would make nuclear weapons obsolete, could paradoxically increase the risk of nuclear war by undermining the fragile stability of mutual vulnerability. The Cold War ended not with nuclear bang, but with the whimper of a collapsing empire. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, fragmenting into 15 independent states, 4 of which, Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan and Belarus, inherited nuclear weapons on their territory. The immediate fear was that these weapons, thousands of warheads and delivery systems, would fall into the wrong hands, sold to rogue states, seized by terrorists, or lost in the chaos of political collapse. International efforts, particularly the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, helped secure and dismantle thousands of warheads. Ukraine, Kazakhstan and Belarus agreed to transfer their nuclear weapons to Russia in exchange for security guarantees and economic assistance. Weapons-grade uranium and plutonium were secured, downblended into reactor fuel or destroyed. Launch codes were changed. Command and control systems were safeguarded. The dismantlement effort was massive, costly, and absolutely necessary. Without it, the post-Cold War world might have seen a dozen new nuclear powers emerge from Soviet collapse. But even with successful dismantlement efforts, the legacy of the Cold War nuclear arsenal remained. Russia inherited the vast majority of Soviet nuclear weapons, maintaining thousands of warheads, many of them hydrogen bombs, deployed on the same delivery systems that had once targeted American cities. the US retained its own large arsenal. Both nations scaled back from Cold War peaks, reducing total numbers through arms control agreements. But both maintained formidable nuclear forces, still capable of mutual destruction, still poised for launch on warning, still central to national security strategies. The hydrogen bomb never exploded in anger, but it came close, terrifyingly close, repeatedly close, and every close call was a reminder that deterrence, for all its logic and sophistication, depended on fragile systems, fallible humans, and luck that might not hold forever. The margin between survival and extinction was far thinner than anyone wanted to admit, narrower than policy documents acknowledged, more precarious than the public ever fully understood. The Cold War demonstrated both the brilliance and the madness of nuclear deterrence. It worked, in the sense that no hydrogen bombs were used in war, no cities were vaporized, no full-scale thermonuclear exchange occurred. But it worked at tremendous cost. Decades of fear, enormous expenditures of resources, close calls that could have ended civilization, and the creation of arsenals so large that their mere existence posed an ongoing risk to human survival. And when the Cold War ended, the hydrogen bomb didn't disappear. It evolved, adapted, and persisted into a new era with new dangers, new uncertainties, and new challenges to the logic of deterrence that had, however imperfectly, kept humanity alive through the darkest decades of the 20th century. As the Cold War faded into history, the hydrogen bomb did not disappear. It evolved, adapting to a world no longer defined by superpower rivalry, but still shaped by nuclear anxieties, proliferation concerns, and the persistent fear that deterrence, which had held for 50 years, might someday fail. The logic of the hydrogen bomb, of deterrence theory, and of strategic doctrine continued to influence global politics, military planning, and international security. But the context had changed fundamentally, and with that change came new dangers, new calculations, and new uncertainties. Today, 9 countries openly possess nuclear weapons: the United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, China, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. Most maintain hydrogen bombs, or thermonuclear devices as part of their arsenals. But the dynamics are different from the bipolar world of the Cold War. The US and Russia, inheritors of Cold War arsenals, still maintain the largest stockpiles, but their relationship is defined less by existential rivalry and more by strategic competition, regional conflicts, and periodic crises that never quite reach Cold War intensity. China, once a relatively modest nuclear power, is expanding its arsenal rapidly. Intelligence assessments suggest China is building hundreds of new missile silos, modernizing its delivery systems, and developing more sophisticated warheads. This expansion has raised fears of a new arms race, a three-way competition between the US, Russia, and China that could destabilize the careful balance maintained through decades of bilateral arms control. India and Pakistan, both nuclear-armed neighbours locked in a volatile regional rivalry, present a different kind of risk. Their conflicts are not global, but they are immediate, emotional, and complicated by territorial disputes, terrorism, and historical grievances. Deterrence operates on a much smaller, more unpredictable scale. A crisis in Kashmir, a terrorist attack, a border skirmish could escalate rapidly to nuclear use. The weapons involved might be smaller than Cold War strategic arsenals, but a regional nuclear war between India and Pakistan could kill tens of millions and have global consequences through climate effects and economic disruption. North Korea's development of hydrogen bombs has destabilized East Asia in ways that were unimaginable during the Cold War. North Korea is an unpredictable, isolated regime armed with weapons it occasionally threatens to use. Unlike the Soviet Union, which was cautious, calculating, and led by officials who understood the consequences of nuclear war, North Korea is harder to read. Its threats may be bluster, bargaining tactics designed to extract concessions, but they create uncertainty and fear that deterrence alone might not be sufficient to manage. Israel, though it maintains a policy of nuclear ambiguity and has never officially confirmed possessing nuclear weapons, is widely believed to have a sophisticated nuclear arsenal, including thermonuclear devices. Israel's nuclear weapons serve as an ultimate deterrent against existential threats, a guarantee that if the state's survival is at stake, it possesses the means to retaliate devastatingly. The logic of deterrence still applies, but with complications in a world of multiple nuclear powers, alliances, proxy wars, and regional conflicts. The risk of escalation is less centralised and more diffuse. A crisis between India and Pakistan could escalate to nuclear war without directly involving the major powers. A miscalculation involving North Korea could trigger a regional catastrophe. The hydrogen bomb, once a tool of global superpower strategy, now exists in a messier, more fragmented strategic environment. Meanwhile, new technologies challenge traditional deterrence in ways that Cold War strategists never anticipated. Cyber warfare can disrupt command and control systems, potentially triggering false alarms, disabling early warning networks, or even interfering with missile guidance systems. A sophisticated cyber attack on nuclear command systems could create the conditions for accidental war, miscommunication, or unauthorized launch. And unlike physical attacks, cyber attacks can be difficult to attribute, creating uncertainty about who is responsible and how to respond. Hypersonic missiles capable of flying at speeds exceeding Mach 5 can evade traditional defences and reduce decision-making time to mere minutes. Russia, China, and the US are all developing hypersonic weapons. These missiles follow unpredictable flight paths, making them hard to track and nearly impossible to intercept with current technology. Hypersonic weapons compress timelines even further than ICBMs, leaving leaders with seconds to assess threats and decide responses. The fog of war, already thick in nuclear crises, becomes impenetrable when weapons arrive faster than decisions can be made. Artificial intelligence, increasingly integrated into military systems, raises the spectre of automated decision-making in nuclear crises. Could AI systems, analysing patterns, detecting launches, and predicting threats, be trusted to recommend or even authorise nuclear responses? Proponents argue that AI could process information faster than humans, reducing the risk of delayed response. Critics warn that AI lacks judgment, context, and the human capacity for restraint. An algorithm, no matter how sophisticated, might not understand when to hold fire, when to question data, when to give leaders more time to think. The integration of AI into nuclear command systems is perhaps the most unsettling development in modern deterrence. It revives the nightmare of the doomsday machine, automated systems that remove human judgment from the nuclear chain. And while no nation openly admits to fully automated launch systems, the drive to reduce decision times, to match adversary capabilities, and to maintain deterrent credibility pushes in that direction. The risk is that in trying to perfect deterrence, we might create systems that make accidental war more likely. Arms control, once a cornerstone of managing nuclear risks, has eroded significantly. The INF Treaty collapsed in 2019, dissolved amid mutual accusations of cheating. Russia had allegedly developed ground-launched cruise missiles that violated the treaty's range limits. The US withdrew formally, citing Russian violations, and immediately began developing its own intermediate-range missiles. The treaty that had eliminated an entire class of destabilizing weapons was gone, and a new generation of missiles was being designed. The New START Treaty, which limits US and Russian strategic warheads and delivery systems, was extended in 2021 for 5 years, but its future remains uncertain. It's the last remaining major arms control agreement between the world's two largest nuclear powers. If it expires without replacement, there will be no legal limits on strategic arsenals for the first time in half a century. Both nations could build as many warheads as they wanted, deploy them on unlimited delivery systems, and restart the arms race that had consumed so much of the Cold War. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, CTBT, which would prohibit all nuclear tests, remains unratified by key states including the United States, China, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. While most nuclear powers maintain voluntary moratoriums on testing, the absence of a binding legal framework creates uncertainty. A return to testing by one nation could trigger others to resume, providing momentum for new weapon designs and renewed competition. Without these agreements, the architecture of arms control, painstakingly built over decades of negotiation, crisis, and compromise, is crumbling. The norms, verification mechanisms, and political commitment that stabilize the nuclear competition are fading. Russia has developed new delivery systems, including nuclear-powered cruise missiles and underwater drones, weapons designed to evade defences and complicate deterrence calculations. The US is modernising its entire nuclear triad at a cost exceeding $1 trillion over 30 years, building new bombers, new missiles, new submarines and new warheads. China is expanding its arsenal and diversifying its delivery systems, moving from minimal deterrence towards something more ambitious and potentially destabilising. Public awareness of the hydrogen bomb has also faded dramatically. During the Cold War, nuclear war was a constant visceral fear. It permeated popular culture, politics and daily life. Children practiced duck and cover drills. Families built fallout shelters. Movies like Dr. Strangelove and The Day After brought nuclear war into living rooms. Songs like 99 Luftballons and Enola Gay reflected nuclear anxieties. The threat was immediate, present, impossible to ignore. But today, nuclear weapons feel abstract, distant, almost forgotten. A new generation has grown up without the shadow of MAD hanging over them, without air raid sirens, without civil defence drills, without the daily awareness that civilization could end in 30 minutes. This complacency is dangerous. The weapons remain, the risks remain. In some ways, the risks have increased as systems age, as new technologies introduce new vulnerabilities, as arms control collapses, and as new nuclear powers emerge with less experience managing the terrible responsibilities that come with these weapons. And yet, the collective vigilance that once kept leaders cautious, that made nuclear war politically unthinkable, that mobilized public opinion against testing and proliferation, has weakened. Politicians can discuss nuclear modernization without facing significant opposition. Defense budgets allocate trillions for new weapons without sustained public debate. The hydrogen bomb, once the most important political and moral issue of the age, has faded from public consciousness, even as it remains as dangerous as ever. The environmental legacy of hydrogen bomb testing also lingers, a radioactive reminder of the price paid for deterrence. Test sites remain contaminated decades after the last explosion. The Nevada test site, Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan, the Pacific, atolls, Novaya Zemlya in the Arctic, all carry scars that will persist for thousands of years. Communities exposed to fallout during atmospheric testing still experience higher cancer rates, birth defects, and other radiation-related illnesses. The Marshall Islands, where the US conducted dozens of hydrogen bomb tests, remain partially uninhabitable, their ecosystems damaged, their people displaced. The Western Shoshone people, whose ancestral lands included the Nevada test site, were exposed to hundreds of nuclear tests without adequate warning, protection, or compensation. Their lands became sacrifice zones in the name of national security, contaminated by radiation that will outlast any human civilization. Similar stories played out in Kazakhstan, where the Semipalatinsk test site exposed nearly 1.5 million people to dangerous radiation levels. Villages near the site experienced horrifying rates of cancer, genetic damage, and environmental devastation. These communities, forgotten, victims of the hydrogen bomb, paid the price for deterrence. They were sacrificed, their health and lands contaminated so that weapons could be tested, refined, and made credible. The fallout from hydrogen bomb testing, both literal and metaphorical, endures long after the explosions have faded. Ethically, the hydrogen bomb continues to provoke deep debate. Is deterrence moral? Can the threat of mass annihilation ever be justified? Religious leaders, philosophers, and activists argue that possessing weapons designed to kill millions of innocent civilians is inherently immoral, regardless of their intended use. The intention may be deterrence, but the capability is genocide. The Catholic Church, through various papal statements, has condemned nuclear weapons while accepting deterrence as a temporary necessary evil, a position that reflects the moral paradox at the heart of nuclear strategy. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW, adopted by the United Nations in 2017 and entered into force in 2021, reflects this ethical stance. It prohibits the development, testing, production, acquisition, possession, stockpiling, use, and threat of use of nuclear weapons. The treaty represents a rejection of deterrence logic, an assertion that nuclear weapons are fundamentally illegitimate tools of power that should be eliminated entirely. But none of the nuclear-armed states have signed the TPNW. They argue that deterrence remains essential for security, that unilateral disarmament would invite aggression, and that eliminating nuclear weapons is impossible without resolving the underlying conflicts and security concerns that led nations to acquire them in the first place. The debate remains unresolved, a fundamental disagreement about whether nuclear weapons prevent war or make it inevitable, whether deterrence is wisdom or madness, whether the hydrogen bomb is humanity's greatest success in preventing catastrophe or its greatest failure in moral judgment. The hydrogen bomb also raises questions about the future, urgent questions that have no clear answers. What happens as technology advances? Could a rogue AI, interpreting ambiguous data, trigger a launch? Could a cyber attack, attributed incorrectly or not at all, create a crisis that spirals out of control? Could terrorism, a non-state actor seizing a nuclear weapon, shatter the logic of state-based deterrence that has held for 70 years? Could climate change, resource scarcity, or geopolitical instability create conditions where nuclear use becomes more likely? As water becomes scarce, as agricultural land diminishes, as migrations increase and borders harden, could nuclear weapons be used not in grand strategic conflicts, but in desperate regional wars over survival? These scenarios, once theoretical, feel increasingly plausible as global stresses mount. The hydrogen bomb, for all its Cold War origins, remains relevant, dangerous, and central to global security. Its power has not diminished, its threat has not faded, and its potential for catastrophe remains as real today as it was when Ivy Mike vaporized Ilujalab Island in 1952. The weapons are smaller now, more efficient, more reliable. The delivery systems are faster, more accurate, harder to defend against. The command systems are more sophisticated, more responsive, more vulnerable to cyber interference. In many ways, the hydrogen bomb of the 21st century is more dangerous than its Cold War predecessor, precisely because it feels less threatening, less immediate, less worthy of constant vigilance. In the end, the hydrogen bomb represents humanity's greatest paradox. It is a weapon we built to never use, a tool of deterrence so powerful it makes war unthinkable, yet so dangerous it could end civilization. It forced us to confront our capacity for destruction and to build systems, strategies, and treaties designed to prevent that destruction. For over 70 years, those systems have held, not perfectly, not without close calls, not without accidents and near misses, but they have held. But history offers no guarantees. Deterrence worked during the Cold War, but that doesn't mean it will work forever. The Cold War was a unique historical moment. Two superpowers, rational leadership on both sides at critical moments, clear communication channels, and a shared understanding of the stakes. The multipolar world of the 21st century is messier, more unpredictable, and potentially more dangerous. New nuclear powers lack the decades of experience that taught Cold War leaders restraint. New technologies introduce new vulnerabilities, and the erosion of arms control removes the guardrails that helped prevent the worst outcomes. The hydrogen bomb remains silent, patient, waiting in silos, submarines and bombers around the world. It sits in arsenals from Montana to Moscow, from submarines prowling beneath the Pacific to mobile launchers moving through Chinese countryside. It waits in bunkers in India and Pakistan, in undisclosed locations in Israel, in primitive but real form in North Korea. It is maintained, modernized, tested in simulations, and kept ready to launch at moment's notice. Every day it exists is another day we live on borrowed time, another day we gamble that deterrence holds, that accidents don't happen, that wisdom prevails over fear, that the systems designed to prevent its use continue to function. The hydrogen bomb was never meant for the battlefield. It was meant for the mind to deter, to threaten, to paralyze decision-making through sheer existential terror. And so far it has succeeded, but we must never forget how close we've come. We must remember Vasily Arkhipov refusing to launch a nuclear torpedo beneath the Caribbean. We must remember Stanislav Petrov trusting his judgment over Soviet protocol. We must remember the false alarms, the training tapes, the computer glitches, the close calls that could have ended everything. We must remember that luck is not a strategy, that accidents happen, that systems fail, and that the margin between survival and extinction is thinner than we would like to believe. The hydrogen bomb changed the world forever. It made war unthinkable. It forced nations to confront the logic of annihilation, and it created a strategic doctrine where the most powerful weapon ever made became the weapon that must never ever be used. Whether that logic, that strange, paradoxical, terrifying logic, will hold forever remains the most important and most frightening question humanity has ever faced. The hydrogen bomb hangs over us still, invisible but present, unused but ready. A promise of annihilation that has, for 70 years, somehow kept us alive. And every morning that we wake up, every day that passes without a nuclear detonation, without a crisis spiralling out of control, without the missiles launching, we have survived another day, not because the threat has passed, but because deterrence, fragile and imperfect as it is, has held for one more day. The hydrogen bomb remains the ultimate test of human wisdom, restraint, and luck. And the test, terrifyingly, is never over. It continues every single day, with every decision, every crisis, every moment where someone with access to these weapons chooses not to use them. That choice, repeated thousands of times across decades by leaders, officers and individuals whose names we'll never know, is why we're still here. And whether that choice will continue to be made day after day, year after year, century after century, is a question only time will answer.